since it is late, I'm going to do a 10-minute game. So for those watching on YouTube, I am recording pretty late. So we're going to do a 10+0 game. And the key change that I made late in the speedrun is that now I basically play my actual repertoire. So instead of the accelerated dragon, I'm orienting toward the knight orf. Here we're facing knight c3, which is the entry point to the Grand Prix attack with f4. It's also the entry point to the closed Sicilian with g3. And if you are a knight orf player, then your move here is d6. And I won't delve into an explanation of why that is. Bishop e5 check is a pretty obscure sideline that has gained some popularity. Obviously, it's more common after knight f3, d6, then it's the canal variation. After knight c3, I've seen it as well, but to be honest, I don't know a lot about it. So I'm basically going to play the same way that I would play against knight f3. And actually, we're transposing into a line that we already have faced. We faced this line through the more conventional move order. That was a speedrun game that I almost lost. It was one of our most fascinating games. Okay, so here our opponent plays it a little bit differently. He plays f4 instead of developing the knight right away to f3. Okay, well, let's force white's hand with a6. I'm going to force this bishop to commit to a position. It goes back to e2. And now we kind of have to solve the problem of the light squared bishop ourselves. And I'm going to do that by simply fianchettoing it on b7 and putting some pressure on the e4 pawn. If you watch the last video carefully, you'll know that in this situation, you have to be very careful about white pushing a5, because that will make it very difficult for us to then push our b pawn without allowing en passant when we're going to have an isolated and very weak a pawn. Bishop to f3. Okay, so probably our opponent is intending bishop b7, e5. That looks rather unpleasant. So I think that we're going to strike in the center ourselves. We're going to play the move e5. And once again, if you're a knight orf player, then you're not really all that afraid of playing the move e5. If you're new to the Sicilian and you're new to pawn structures in general, you might look at this move and say, well, you're creating a huge hole on d5, but we've already gone through this. Like, the hole on d5 is annoying, but it's very well covered by black's pieces. In particular, we're covering it with two of our pieces at the same time, the bishop and the knight, which will make it very difficult for white in the long run to plant a knight on d5. So our opponent continues to develop their pieces. We are going to do the same, and we're going to get a very rich position as a result. Very, very interesting structure. g4. Whoa. Okay, so our opponent initiates very direct action on the king side. And the sort of general formula when your opponent does stuff like this, right, starts rushing in with a rapid fire kingside attack before even castling, is to do what? Like, what's the very kind of high level thing that you're supposed to do when your opponent starts playing on the flank without having completed their development? How does the principle go? So the principle dictates kind of two things. Either you play in the center, but more broadly, you're supposed to open up the center, because by opening up the center, you sort of underscore the underdeveloped nature of your opponent's position. So here, the thematic move would, of course, be to play d5, but d5 clearly doesn't work, right? White just plays e takes d5, and we don't have enough defenders. So instead, what we're going to do is actually just take on f4. And then we're immediately going to plant a knight on e5. So we're not opening up the center per se, we're playing in the center. And by playing in the center, we're already highlighting the vulnerable nature of these pieces, right? By playing the move g4, white has created an undefended bishop on f3, and white's position just seems very, very loose here. Okay, so knight g3 is an excellent move. Now give me a second to think. This is an important moment. So we can take the bishop and secure the bishop pair. We can kind of tread water by castling kingside, which is actually not such a bad idea. Or we could play this very positionally, and we could actually make the move g6, which I like, which we're going to make in order to fully restrict this knight on g3. We've talked about this scenario many, many times when there's two squares that separate a knight and a pawn in the same file. And that scenario is very favorable for the side that has the pawn, because the knight is restricted, the pawn acts kind of like a spike, and we're immobilizing the knight. So we go g6. Again, this is a 10-minute game, so I'm commenting things a lot faster. It is quite late, so I apologize if the pace is a little bit too frenetic for those watching on YouTube, but also that's kind of what makes it fun. Let's see how our opponent tries to continue his kingside attack. Okay. Nice position here for us. We're not worried about bishop takes knight because we just recapture with a pawn, and then we increase our control over key squares in the center, right? We get the bishop pair, we get the dark squares, and we get potential access to the d4 square for our queen, or maybe even later our knight. Bishop h6. So our opponent continues to try to pound us on the king side. And again, if we think about this thematically, when white's expending as much effort as he is trying to prevent us from castling kingside, well, okay, there's still the queen side, and I can totally see us castling the other way, right? Going queenside where there are fewer pieces, right? There's fewer chaos. And yeah, we've pushed some pawns on the queen side, but white doesn't have the firepower, I think, to exploit our king if it runs over to the queen side. So what are we going to do? Let's go queen d7. And I think we're almost ready to castle queenside. Let's consider that for a second. Yeah, castles queenside. Okay, there is the move g5. But I'm not too scared of the move g5. I think we're going to go queenside here. Actually, maybe I should have been. Nah, g5, we can drop our knight back to e8, for example. g5, we can drop our knight back to e8. Let me Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so g5 is on the board. Now we have to be very careful, because if we drop our knight back to g8, we blunder the rook to bishop g7. If we start by taking the bishop, then we allow the queen to jump into position. We definitely don't want to do that. So we definitely want to drop our knight back to e8. That's really the only move. Now, the knight on e8 is not a great piece, but it can be very easily rerouted via c7, potentially to e6, where it will then pressure the g5 pawn and have access to a nice central square on g4. Important tactical detail, obviously, bishop g4 does not win the queen. Anytime you have queen-king alignment on the same diagonal, and your opponent possesses a bishop of that color, you have to be extra careful. But here, the knight does a great job of taking the sting out of bishop g4. Our opponent continues to pound us on all sides of the board, but he continues to overextend himself. And of course, we should take this knight and eliminate the outposts. And now, we should take a moment to think. Because what are the biggest problems in our position? Well, one of the biggest problems is this knight. But we don't necessarily want to rush with knight c7. Are there any more creative ways that we could try to involve this knight and potentially open up the position? Well, I'm looking at the move f5 here, and I really, really like the appearance of this move. We're going to go f5. And this is a bit of a hard move to explain briefly. I'll try to explain it after the game. Among other things, it creates, first of all, this is a protected passed pawn. So this is a pretty major asset. We're also restricting the bishop, but we're also opening up this little retreat square for our knight, which can suddenly drop back to f7. And I'm eyeing this bishop pawn construction, and I'm seeing how vulnerable it is, right? This bishop on h6 is just kind of stuck. Okay, our opponent takes on Passat. But now the second idea, which is that our knight has now jumped back into the game. Knight takes f6. The center has opened up, and white's king is starting to feel very uncomfortable. But bishop g2 by our opponent, preparing to castle kingside. Man, this guy is really good. Okay. I like the look of knight h5 here. Trying to open up the kingside even further. Okay, we can play bishop f8 and go for the bishop trade, but then our opponent can drop back to g5. I like the look of knight to h5 here. Continuing to use our knight as kind of a battering ram. Now, of course, this is technically a pawn sacrifice. White can take twice on h5. But one detail is that after knight takes h5, we could potentially throw in a check on h4, force the king into the center, and then recapture the knight. But that might actually be counterproductive because the closer white's king is to the queen side, the safer it's going to be. So after knight takes h5, I think we're just going to take back and hope for the best in that position. Although, I mean, it's complicated. Bishop h4 has its own appeal. Huh. Knight h5 might have been a mistake, but I feel like we're continuing to do everything within our power to punish white for keeping his king in the center. Okay. Yeah, knight h5 is a weird move. But of course, the actual idea is to open up the g file. Like, the actual idea is to open up the g file. What's on the g file? There's a bishop on g2. And more importantly, after white castles kingside, white's king will be on the g file. So I'm basically sacrificing a pawn and preparing for the eventuality that white castles kingside. And this is not a major pawn, right? This is just a g pawn. I don't think it's going to be a big deal with as many pieces on the board as we have. Also, kind of playing a little bit against our opponent's clock here. Knight h5 is the kind of move that's going to make anybody think for a while. Okay, so again, bishop h4, king d2, gh, queen h5, rook g8, bishop e4. That looks... Yeah, let's take on h5. Let's make this a little bit more open-ended for our opponent. Because again, less than 4 minutes now. You got to keep an eye on your opponent's clock in these situations. And oftentimes, the more open-ended moves are the ones which are going to make people think for a little bit longer. So what's going on in this position? We have a very powerful knight on e5. We have a pretty compact structure. Let's go rook g8, I think. Yeah, let's go rook g8. Obviously, this hits the bishop. This activates the rook. And white can still castle. Yeah, white can definitely still castle. But then he would be castling right into a pin. Bishop e4. Yeah, man, this guy is very, very, very strong. We have to move our king over to b8 because the threat was bishop f5, and that did win the queen. b3. What a move. Preparing castling queenside. Okay. That's bold. Let's go bishop f6, activating our bishop. Activating our bishop, putting it on the long diagonal, x-raying the rook. And kind of goading white into castling now the other way, castling queenside. But even if white castles queenside, it's not the end of the story. We can still, I think, use our active minor pieces in order to cause serious practical problems to the white king. Yeah, definitely black is worse from an objective standpoint. But practically, I think white's position is very difficult to play. And I'd definitely be interested in exploring the earlier part of the game with an engine, because I did feel like I got kind of outplayed. But I don't know exactly what I did wrong. So one idea that we have here is to go c4 and blast open the entire queenside. But that's sort of a more brazen approach to the position. Remember that we're only down a pawn here, so we don't need to do anything ultra drastic. A more measured way of trying to attack on the queenside would be the move b5, right? And you might look at b5 and you go, I don't get how this is helping us attack white's king. Well, there's steps to this, right? We need to open up a pathway to white's king, and that's what I'm trying to do with the move b5. If white plays a takes b5, think about what piece you want to capture with. Do you want to recapture with a queen? Do you want to recapture with a pawn? White plays a5 and tries to keep the queenside closed, but now a5 itself has become a very serious target. Well, can we attack that target? I believe that we can. We can attack it by shifting our queen over to c7. Now the bishop controls a5, but we can shove b4 down and cut off the connection between the bishop and the pawn. Not only are we threatening queen takes a5, but that comes with a tremendous threat of checkmate on a1, which means we can take on a5, ignoring the threat of d takes e5. And suddenly, we are the first ones to create a checkmating threat. And the tactics begin. Now, what do I see when I look at this position? Well, one important thing to notice is the role that can potentially be played by the bishop. This bishop is controlling a1. If we can remove the pawn from d4, the bishop and the queen can combine, and potentially it can pose unstoppable threats of checkmate on a1. So you might say, well, let's move the knight, right? Let's play knight d7, and then we'll be threatening bishop takes d4. And that's not a bad move, but you can kind of use the knight as a flamethrower. You can try to say, I'm going to use the knight and buy myself a tempo. So I'm going to make a move that forces white to respond to it, and then I'm going to play bishop takes d4 and create the mate threat on a1. So what am I getting at? Like, how do you use the knight in the smartest possible way? Well, you can sacrifice it. How can you sacrifice it? I like the look of knight c4. Why does this force white to take the knight? Well, because we have a million threats that we're posing with this knight. Knight a3 check, knight takes d2. White basically has to take this knight. Then we play bishop takes d4. We're threatening mate on a1, and white has no good defense against that threat. I think the only thing white will be able to do after bishop takes d4 is to play c3, but then we just play bc, and our king is completely safe. That's the main part of this whole equation. White isn't even close to attacking our king, so we have all the time in the world to accumulate the attack against white's king. Whew. Crazy, crazy, crazy game, but I think we're starting to gain the upper hand here. Bishop c1, what a move. That one I missed. Okay, now wait a second. The point is bishop takes d4, rook takes d4. Now we can play knight a3 check. Bishop takes a3, queen takes a3. Looks very, very strong for black. Looks very strong for black. Is there anything else that we could do? Well, we could try to deflect the bishop with rook g5, but white's not going to take it. That's the problem. Let's go knight a3 check. Now, after bishop takes a3, we could also even take on a3 with the pawn. And the appeal of that is that it poses the threat of queen to c3. But queen takes a3 creates the threat of bishop takes d4, and I don't see a particularly good answer to that threat. Let's go queen takes a3. Of course, we have to be very careful because now our own king is kind of left to its own devices now that the queen is kind of hunting for gold on the queen side. Our king is just sort of left there. And if white can find a way to generate threats against the king, the situation becomes very double-edged. But I don't see a way for white to do that. Okay, queen f7 looks very intimidating, but I don't really know what it does. This move looks very, very intimidating, but it doesn't really create any concrete threats. In fact, rather than myopically just taking on d4, I think we have potentially a game-winning combination, which I have to calculate, but we don't have much time to calculate, so I'm just going to go with my intuition, and my intuition is to play the move c4. I want to drive the pawn down to c3 and create a lobster pincer mate on b2, or a lollies mate, as it's more formally known. White has to take the pawn, and then we push b3, creating more mate threats against white's king. This has to be mating in my kind of tactical assessment. B takes a3, or c takes b3. Let's grab this pawn first with a check. Now let's find the mate. Now let's find the mate. Oh, I think I found it. I think all we need to do is shift our king over to a8. I think the most clinical mating move is to go king to a8. And the point is that if white plays rook b1, we had queen a3 mate. Now we take on d4, we deflect the rook, we give a check, we give another check, we give another check, and we deliver mate on a1. Or on b1, rather. Wow. What an end to the game. Man, that felt like it was a bullet game, but it actually was a 10-minute game. Crazy how different a 10-minute game feels. Even though this was originally the speedrun time control, it was 10 minutes. But now it feels like I was out of breath from like move one. What a game. Okay, a lot to look at for sure. Again, for those watching on YouTube, this is a somewhat more frenetic speedrun than 15 plus 10, but this is a popular time control, so it's not a bad idea for people to know what this feels like at a high level. And I definitely think there was enough time to make decently high quality moves. Great game by our opponent. That came down to the wire, and the tactics at the end were really cool. So again, we're facing a non-mainline Sicilian, which is ultra popular now. I think the open Sicilian with knight f3 and d4 is perhaps less popular than it's ever been, which is not to say it's unpopular. I mean, obviously people still play it, but you know, all of these anti-Sicilians have gotten incredibly, incredibly popular. So our move is d6, and now white delivers a check on b5, which is it's an obscure line, but I faced it a couple of times at a higher level in Blitz. So just to keep this straight in your mind, obviously the canal is knight f3, d6, bishop b5 check. And this is a very reputable system. I've played this with white. We faced this particular line with a4 a couple of games ago. Now you might say, well, what difference does it make that white has a knight on c3 instead of on f3? Well, in certain instances, it doesn't make any difference at all. You can conceivably come up with some lines which transpose into a canal, but typically it's considered inaccurate for white to commit the knight to c3 too early, because in a lot of lines in the canal, in a lot of lines, white actually pushes that c pawn either to c3 or even to c4, trying to get kind of a Morozzi bind setup. So by committing the placement of the knight to c3, white is eliminating all of these possible plans connected with the move c3 and c4. So white's narrowing down their options a little bit. Okay. So I'm going to check the engine really quickly after bishop b5 check and see what the computer thinks is the best way to equalize here. Okay, according to the engine, the best move here is actually to play bishop d7, not to play knight d7. And this looks like a dead equal position. So after bishop takes d7, queen takes d7, there's like hundreds of games in the database. Magnus has played this with white. So Magnus has actually played this system with white. You go d4, cd4, and then queen takes d4. Very computerish kind of idea. Knight c6, and then the queen drops back to d3. This has been played pretty extensively by a lot of GMs. There's an Azerbaijani GM named Gadir Gusainov who's a huge fan of this. I see a ton of his games in the database. And typically in such positions, the way that you want to develop with black is kind of dragon style with g6. Typically in a lot of these canal positions, you don't want to go e6 because this is a little bit passive. You want to go g6. And that's the main line. g6, knight f3, bishop g7, white castles. I mean, it's just an equal position. It's not nothing to write home about. Knight f6, and now the main line is knight d5. Now the main line is knight d5. Black castles. White plays bishop g5, trying to apply pressure on the knight on f6. And here, here actually the engine gives several ways to equalize. The simplest one is just to play knight d5 and knight e5 and force a bunch of minor pieces off the board, and the position is basically dead equal. The only thing that you have to be careful about with black in this position is just to make sure that actually you can even play bishop f6 and take the last pair of minor pieces off the board. And this position may seem visually slightly worse for black, but in fact it's completely equal because white has no way to attack black's weaknesses. You can always play f5. The pawn on d5 is itself a little bit tender, and you're going to gain e-file control by playing rook f to e8. So this is essentially a dead draw, I think. So this is a pretty boring line. The engine also gives a very interesting type of idea, which is not uncommon when you're trying to smoke out the knight from d5. Right? So basically the idea is that you cannot go e6 because you blunder the knight on f6, right? You can't do that. So what you sometimes do is you actually move this knight out of the way in order to be able to play e6 and chase the knight out of d5. And you can put that knight on f6 on several different squares. You can play knight g4, but the problem with knight g4 is that you walk right into h3. You can play knight h5, but then the knight is kind of weirdly on the rim, although Grishuk did play knight h5. The engine actually likes the move knight to e8, which looks like the most passive of black's options. But the key thing to understand is that after, let's say, white plays rook a d1, black plays e6, what is the role played by the knight on e8? The knight on e8 is a purely defensive piece, but it's a very important piece because it's guarding the d6 pawn. Okay, and what does that allow black to do? That buys black tempi, and black can use these tempi to generate very serious play on the king side with this move f5. f5 is a very powerful move. It has been played once in the game Christopher Yu against Puya Idani, who's an Iranian GM, and black actually won the game. In that game, after EFGF, black just gets this very, very nice pawn formation in the center. Christopher Yu played knight c4, and here black moved the queen over to f7, sacrificing the pawn on d6. But after e5, again, black's pawns are starting to steamroll white in the center. The queen is very awkward. And Christopher, you ended up losing the game. It's given all zeros by the engine. So that kind of is the main line. That's the main line. Of course, also possible, if we rewind all the way back to this position, is the move f4, which is kind of a souped up Grand Prix attack, but it doesn't make much sense to play a Grand Prix attack structure without the light squared bishop. Because if you remember, in the traditional Grand Prix, which goes f4, knight c6, knight f3, g6, white's light squared bishop is an integral part of their attacking scheme. So to like trade the bishops and then say, oh, now I'm going to play a Grand Prix attack, this just looks completely innocuous. And against f4, I would probably just play the same way that I would play against a Grand Prix, which is knight c6, knight f3. And again, you kind of adopt the dragon setup. So castles, bishop g7, d3. A lot of games in the database here. This is not a particularly theoretically challenging line. And here I would adopt the Bortnyk setup. I would play e6, and then I would go knight g to e7, which is a setup that I've talked about pretty extensively. This is called the Bortnyk setup. And this essentially takes the sting out of the move f5. Although white can play f5 even in this position. Wesley So actually lost a game here. But the best line here is ef, ef, and then just knight g7. ef, ef, knight g7, completing your development. fg, and actually you're supposed to play fg, opening up the f file, because if white tries to pounce with knight g5, you just send the knight back with h6. And if white plays knight f7, this is actually very, very cool. What do you think black should do in this position? Where should the rook go? Where should the rook go in this position? I'll let you think about that for a second. Let me use the bathroom real quick. Yeah, rook h7 is the move. The move is rook h7. Now, you should be aware that in these types of situations, you actually can castle. That is legal. That is legal. But this only leads to a draw. Because white's knight has an escape, you play king h7. Now the knight is hanging, so it has to go back to f7. You go back to g8, and you get this hilarious repetition. But if you want to play for an advantage, you go rook h7, and now the knight is stuck on f7. And as I've said many, many, many times, this is a situation that should raise a tactical red flag. What situation am I talking about? Well, the bigger the distance between two pieces that are defending each other, the likelier it is that you're going to have an interception tactic where you literally stick a piece, one of your pieces, between two of your opponent's pieces. And of course, there are varying degrees of complexity when it comes to this particular type of theme. Here it's very simple, right? If you identify the weak link in white's position, you should quickly see that knight to f5 is going to be your next move against almost anything that white can throw at you, particularly if white plays, for instance, bishop e3. Then you play knight f5 and white's position is in shambles. White's position collapses. One example that I always like to show on this topic of interposing is one of my games. And I've shown this game several times before in the speedrun, but I like reusing examples because it really allows us to hammer home certain concepts. And I think that's not done enough in chess instruction, right? You're reusing examples. Constantly looking at the same example helps you hammer it into your head. So here it is. This is old game of mine from 2008 against an IM. You can see I'm 2300 when this game was played. Okay, so this position was reached. And black is worse in an endgame. But I very confidently played rook takes f2, of course. Very confidently. Thinking that my opponent was born yesterday. Completely missing white's next move. What did white do? How do you note that you have to look for something? Well, there's a vast distance between the two rooks that are defending each other. This screams interference tactic. And once you start looking for it, you will find the move bishop to f3, intercepting the two rooks. And it's easy to observe that after gf, king f2, very important. Notice that the white rook is protecting the forking square. That's something that you would have had to see while calculating. And when the smoke clears, white is simply up in exchange and winning the game. Okay, I took with the rook, but it doesn't matter. White is up in exchange, and I ended up losing the game. So good little tactical lesson here. When the distance between two pieces defending each other is, the bigger the distance, the higher the probability that something is going to appear. So where were we? Yeah, so this is like the theoretical line with f4. So just to close off our little summary, I think bishop d7 is the safer move. I played a slightly more adventurous move, but knight d7 appears to be inaccurate in this particular version of the canal with the knight on c3. According to the engine, bishop d7 is just a much safer move. Just something to file away if you are studying the speedrun with an eye toward improving your opening. So it's a knight d7, which actually has been played a lot by a lot of GMs. So it's not a mistake. It just might not be the best way to equalize. Okay, so white played a4, which is a very popular move nowadays in these types of systems, expanding on the queen side and preparing to push the pawn all the way down to a5. And in so doing, it makes it difficult for black to operate on the queen side. Like a4 is an ultra positional move. And at a lower level, I think a lot of people instinctively respond with a6. And one of the more concrete ideas of the move a4 is that this can be met with bishop takes d7 check. And now what move that really highlights the crux of white's strategy? This is, again, purely positional. This has nothing to do with tactics. This is purely about square control. Yeah, white plays a5. And you might look at this and say, well, what's the big deal? And actually, in this particular version, this is not a big deal. So in response to a6, I would probably not take the knight. I would play bishop to c4. And only after a move like e6 would I consider the move a5, clamping down on black's pawn chain and making it very undesirable for black to expand on the queen side because of a takes b6. And now you have to deal with this long-term weakness on a6. You will see this type of idea across many, many, many different openings, even in the King's Indian, right? You think this has nothing to do with the King's Indian, but in the King's Indian, this is very standard fare. If we follow the main line of the King's Indian, let's say we take the Petrosian variation, right? Just random illustration. Very frequently, you will see that in the King's Indian, black has this knight on c5, and then black plays the move a5 in order to prevent white from pushing b4. And less experienced King's Indian players from the white side often automatically play a3. Well, let's reinforce the threat of b4. But here it's the same concept. Black plays a4, exactly the same thing. White can still play b4, but it's associated now with the weakening of the a3 pawn, let alone the fact that white would have to recapture with the knight and allow knight takes c4, which loses a pawn. But again, illustrating the more general concept here, if that makes sense. So that's a good application of the King's Indian. Okay, so a4, we decided to prioritize the development of our kingside pieces. We play knight f6. White plays f4, which I think is a very reasonable move. That's a more tactical way of fighting for the advantage here. And I still see games in the database. This is the main line, actually, f4. A Wonder Liang had a game here with white against Anton Korobov. A lot of GM games still in this position. Okay, so a6 and bishop back to e2, which is a very, very good move. Also possible was bishop c4. That was the A Wonder Korobov game. But bishop e2, a couple of games in the database, including a game by Gadir Gusenov, who is like the leading specialist in this line. So I actually think that my next move might have been a serious inaccuracy. We played the move b6. And the reason I played this move, well, there's two reasons. The first is we wanted to deploy the light-squared bishop to b7 and apply immediate pressure on the e4 pawn. And I will be honest, I completely forgot about this move. In my mind, I thought that white would just continue developing with a knight. And now black's plan is fully justified. We play bishop b7, or we could even start with e6 and then play bishop b7, and black is completely fine. According to the engine, it's actually a better idea to go at it from the other side and to actually play g6. And I was worried about allowing a5, but a5 is really not such a big deal. We can continue to play chess here, like bishop g7, knight f3. And actually the engine, after castles, the engine actually wants black to play b5 anyway, because it believes that the activity garnered by this trade is sufficient, compensates for the weakness created on a6. And obviously a6 is not the kind of weakness that's going to decide the game, right? White is probably best advised to play king h1 here and get out of the x-ray, bishop b7, d3, and the position is approximately equal. We could even expand on the queen side a little bit with the move a5. It's just a double-edged, typical Sicilian type position, right? Nothing to write home about, but apparently g6 was a little bit more accurate than the move we played. After bishop f3, right away, white creates like very, very concrete problems for us because e5 is a huge threat. So if bishop b7, then e5 literally wins the game for white. Why does it win the game for white? Well, first of all, you cannot play de5 because the bishop hangs. You have to take the bishop. White recaptures with the knight, reinforcing the e5 pawn. And this is a very classic scenario that you have to be super, super careful about, where white's driving the pawn down and you're just not sufficiently developed. So for example, after d5, fe5, knight g4, who can tell me in this position what's a very thematic kind of move that you always have to be super, super careful about allowing, again, across many, many different openings? Yeah, of course, you automatically play e6, you throw the pawn down to shatter black's king position, and now you make the very calm response queen e2 in order to control the e5 square. Why is it important to control the e5 square? Because if you play h3, you allow black's knight to jump back to e5 and kind of diffuse the tension. So queen e2 is actually a very typical follow-up. And black has no moves. Black is totally buried here. Like there's just no way to develop the bishop, and it's +3 for white. So important detail there, and that is why I thought it was proper to strike back at the center with e5. But I think that in this position, black is in fact slightly worse. White's got a very nice compact center, a nice way of developing the knight to e2. And of course, black does have to deal with the weakness of the d5 square in the long run. So anyways, we play d5. And I still see... No, so bishop f3 is actually a novelty according to the engine. e5, d3, bishop b7, knight g2, bishop b7. So here we're both just developing our pieces. And of course, the next big moment is this very committal move g4. Probably with white, I would try to play this a little bit more positionally with castles, and something like knight g3, trying to get the knight to f5. I would play this a little bit more positionally from the white side, but our opponent really went full tilt with g4. Okay, so in response to play on the side of the board, you strike at the center, which is exactly what we're doing. We play e takes f4, bishop f4, and we create for ourselves a very nice square for the knight on e5. In addition, by playing knight d7 to e5, we open up the d7 square for the other knight. So in the event that white plays g5, we won't have to go all the way back to g8. And if you're a long-term Sicilian player, then this kind of idea should be pretty standard fare. Here is a game from many, many years ago where I fell victim to this exact idea in a slightly different position. So watch this. And this is how I knew to play e takes f4, knight e5 so quickly, because I'm familiar with this idea. So you can see in this game, I'm 1900. This is a Najdorf. And in this position, I prematurely played the move g4, trying to get the kingside attack started. Now watch how similar this is. Black moves away to d7 with the knight. And here I make a follow-up mistake, bishop f3. Now who can tell me from the black side how black should punish white for overextending too early on the king side? And yeah, there's a trick question here. It's not immediately e5. Excellent. And pause the video if you're watching on YouTube. Make sure that you are actively engaged in this, because these are important ideas of the Sicilian that you have to know if you want to play it well. Okay, so I see somebody suggesting f5, but that just blunders e6 with a fork. Yeah, so you play knight takes d4. If you start with e5, you're giving white the f5 square for no reason. So you start by playing knight takes d4, and now you strike with e5. And suddenly white's position falls apart. F takes e5, knight takes e5, and look at what black has achieved. Black has achieved a monster knight. Black has achieved dark square control that prevents white from pushing the g-pawn. Black has achieved an open center, which really underscores the weakness of white's king, and black's position is now much easier to play. So this concept, knight takes d4 and e5, very, very similar. You open up the e5 square for your knight. In the game, I did something a little bit, the position was different, so I played e takes f4, but same type of idea to open up the e5 square in response to the move g4. Okay? So, all right. So knight e5, knight g3, g6, which is a pretty sensible move, controlling the f5 square. I think the position is probably about equal here. That would be my very rough guess. I think the position is pretty double-edged. We played queen d7 in order to hit the g4 pawn and prepare to castle queenside. h3 castles queenside. So this, of course, leads to very, very complicated struggle. Now, if you're watching this and analyzing with an engine, in such positions which are not well defined, there's generally going to be like 3 or 4 pretty decent moves at every turn. So, for instance, if you flip the engine on, you'll see that bishop f8 is possible. You'll see that knight f to d7 is possible, intending bishop g5 to trade off the dark squared bishops and gain control over the dark squares. You'll see that a lot of moves are possible. We took a more direct, aggressive approach, which is consistent with my style, but you could also play this more positionally by moving the knight back and preparing to play bishop to g5. Just finishing up a speedrun here. Queen to d7, h3, castles queenside, and g5. Another very, very committal move, but I think a very good one by our opponent. So again, knight g8, bishop g7 loses the rook, and I didn't want to take this bishop because I thought that the knight on e5 is kind of the pride and joy of our position. So I didn't really see a reason to allow white's queen to jump into position, particularly because in that position, we run the risk of losing the f7 pawn. Okay, so back to e8 we go. White sticks the knight right in the center. Of course, we have to take it. And here, f5. Okay, so f5 is one of those pretty thematic moves with the aim of establishing a protected passed pawn, but with the more primary aim of luring white into taking en passant so that we could reactivate the knight and so that the knight could be doing something specific, in this case, pressuring d5. Does that make sense? Alternatives would include bishop f8, possible, trading off the bishops and putting the rook in position. And on the next move, we definitely are going to push the f-pawn in order to open up the file for the rook. So some of you might be looking at this and saying, well, isn't g5 a serious mistake? Because doesn't this put the bishop in jail? Yes, it does, but the placement of one piece does not determine the whole evaluation. g5 has a very clearly defined minus in that it imprisons the bishop, but it also has a couple of pluses. In particular, it forces the knight to the back rank, so it seriously hurts the coordination of black's pieces, and it's going to take us quite a few moves in order to reestablish that coordination. And 3 or 4 tempi is very, very valuable in a position as complex as this one. Also, the bishop on h6, while imprisoned, is not a liability. Black can't win the bishop, right? Because it's always going to be defended by this pawn. And if white needs to reinforce that pawn, well, white can play h4 in the future. Okay, so there's just more to it than that. And if you just pick out one element of the position, say, oh, well, the bishop's imprisoned, white's worse, that doesn't tell the whole story. So knight d5 takes f5, white takes en passant. We took back with a knight, and white decides to save their bishop with bishop to g2. According to the engine, at least the chess.com engine, knight takes f6, believe it or not, was an inaccuracy, and I was supposed to recapture with the bishop, which to me is very counterintuitive because that goes against the whole purpose of playing f5 in the first place, which is to reactivate the knight. But the point is that after bishop to g2, black has a very concrete resource that actually forces white to give up this bishop. So after knight f6, bishop g2, white was able to preserve the bishop pair, and that caused a lot of problems for black. But after bishop f6, bishop g2, what additional resource would black have that really makes the move bishop g2 a big mistake? This is all very, very intricate, I know, but it's the way that it is, right? It's just the way that this position is. Bishop h4 is correct. Bishop h4 is correct, creating a very, very unpleasant pin against the knight and forcing white to contort himself in order to not lose material. This is already very, very unpleasant. Long story short, bishop takes f6 creates this concrete threat of bishop h4, and so it sort of forces white to bail out into this endgame where black can grab an extra pawn on b2. So anyways, all of that is great. White plays bishop g2. Now we decided to sacrifice a pawn in order to open up the g file. But I realized after bishop e4 that we're kind of running out of active ideas. And I also realized that white can prepare castles queenside. So around here, I think black is worse. But practically, it's very hard for white to play because white can't castle. White would give up a4 and queen a1 would be a huge problem. White can't castle kingside because it's illegal and we're controlling the g file. So in a way, white's king is stranded in the center. And when you analyze such positions with the engine, you get a very misleading picture of a position like this because the engine gives plus 0.89 or plus 1. And it gives the move rook f1, but rook f1 is a hard move to play, right? It doesn't really seem to do anything. And black can keep accumulating the pressure in the center with a move like rook to e8, creating that x-ray against the e-file. The engine also suggests actually to castle and to simply slide the king over to b1, defending all of the squares, all of the infiltration squares along the a-file. But would you like playing the position with white after c4 with c3 to come? I mean, d4, c3, b3, and apparently white is okay because queen a3, bishop c1, and white actually wins. So you start analyzing and you start realizing that from a practical perspective, white's position is still quite difficult to play. b3, bishop f6. Castles, b5, continuing the pressure. And white is still better according to the engine. But after a5, queen c7, I think this was the turning point. I think this was the point at which white's advantage evaporates and at which black seizes the initiative. So apparently in this position, the engine move was queen to f5. This was the engine move, forcing the queen trade. Well, it doesn't force the queen trade. Black can decline the queen trade with queen e7, but that lessens the pressure on the a4 pawn. And now white can play rook hf1 and hit this bishop. Black has to go bishop g5 check, and then rook takes g5, and white insists on trading queens with queen f6 with a better endgame. Obviously, white has a better endgame because white is up a pawn. We have a very strong knight on e5, so black has good drawing chances, but white is really not risking here. So again, it's these hard engine moves that you have to find in very complex positions. And this is why it's hard for the speedrun to have instructive value at these higher levels, because a lot of it boils down to finding moves like queen f5. How do you find moves like this? Well, you have to just examine the position concretely. You have to see that there's a lot of pressure on the a4 pawn. And the best thing to do in situations where your king is weak in the long run is to trade queens, right? That should just kind of be on your bucket list. And if it's on your bucket list, then queen f5 is a little bit more findable. In the game, white played a5. We immediately switch to the attack on a5. And of course, our opponent missed b4. Again, interception, right? This has been a theme of this game, interference. We use the pawn stepping in front of the bishop and creating the unstoppable threat of queen takes a5. I think after d4, the game is close to being over. Although, amazingly here, apparently knight to d3 was even stronger. That's crazy. But we'll get to that in a second. according to the engine, the only way for white to garner defensive chances would have been to go the other way. How counterintuitive is that? You have to go toward the center to D1 and E2. Black is still better after knight D7, but I don't know any human who would not assume that king B1 is the only way to defend against the threat of queen A1 mate. Crazy. So apparently you had to make space for the king to run in the other direction, which, by the way, is not an uncommon defensive technique. You should remember that, right? When you feel like your king is busted on one side of the board, a very classic technique involves moving away the rook, and then making a mad dash for the king toward the center, or using your actual king to make a mad dash toward the center. And one very instructive example that I gave in my book many years ago is this position, where it is... Actually, no, that's the wrong game. Well, it's the right game, but there we go. It's Iliescas against Andersen. Grandmaster game. Let's flip the board. So in this position, black is under a massive kingside attack, and white's last move was rook to h3. What did Andersen do as a last resort in this position? White wants to play bishop f6 and queen takes h7 checkmate. Obviously, h6, bishop h6 is game over immediately. So what else remains but to run king g8? Now, white obviously takes the knight, which is a mistake, and takes and king f8 and king e7. And then rook to d7 to make a little envelope for the king on d8. Black is completely safe. White's attack fizzles out, and black ends up winning the game. Okay. So I could show the rest of the game, but I'm just trying to illustrate a point. Very similar concept, right? So you're looking at this position. You're like, oh, no, he's going to play queen a5, and he's going to stick the queen on a1. Don't assume that the only way to go is toward the attack. You can also move away the rook and make a little escape route for the king to e2. And of course, the bishop on e4 plays a very important defensive role. Without the bishop, black would have had this move slicing off the escape route and setting up the threat of ladder checkmate. But because white has a monopoly over the light squares, this actually is a lot more feasible, if that makes sense. Okay, so after d4, queen takes a5, obviously white can't take the knight because of checkmate. King to b1. And now knight c4. Now, apparently, this is a little bit less accurate than knight to d3. Because after bishop d3, bishop d4, it's easy to observe that this checkmate is essentially unstoppable. White can play c3, black plays bc, and the threats against white's king are overwhelming. There's this classic technique. You give away the pawn, and you checkmate on a2. So here, white can resign. Bishop e1. Now you can play c2 check again, and it's the same exact concept. So what is the difference between sticking the knight on d3 and then playing knight c4? So here, remember, our opponent played this very, very powerful defensive move, which I missed. What's the difference? Well, here, if white plays bishop c1, we can play bishop takes d4, and the knight acts as an umbrella. It guards the bishop against the rook, whereas after knight c4, bishop c1, this would be a horrible mistake because white would be able to eliminate the attacker and then eliminate the other attacker, and suddenly black's attack fizzles out. Another interference, another interception. Now, this one is like a second-order interception. It's not clear what it is you're intercepting until you actually look at the line. Does that make sense? Umbrella, shield, however you want to call it. You use the knight as a shield to guarantee safe passage to d4 for the black bishop. Crazy. Knight c4, bishop c1, and the game continues. Knight a3 check. Still, the engine gives a near decisive advantage for black. And after queen f7, c4, the game is over. Yeah, I did everything correctly. This is winning. But white could have stayed in the game with the move rook to d3. And after bishop d4, white sacks the exchange, and the game continues. Black doesn't have an attack anymore, so you're just going to have to evacuate your queen and essentially convert this like you would any material advantage. But with a passed h-pawn and an airy king, there's a lot remaining to be done. So white had to play this move rook to d3. Instead, our opponent went for the counteroffensive and allowed this very, very pretty decisive tactic with c4. Of course, the idea is to play lobster pincer checkmate. And after bc, classic concept, b3, right? It's this concept of giving away one pawn and then shoving the second one down to the square vacated by your opponent's pawn. This is a classic attacking technique. The point is, after queen takes f6, to play a quiet move like king to a8 with the unstoppable plan of rook b8. And black's just going to have too many threats against white's king. Okay? So c takes b3 is just game over. King a8, of course, is a quiet move, but I think an obvious move. And then the final nail in the coffin, of course, queen a3 check and rook b8 is possible, but I just wanted to eliminate white's rook so that this is guaranteed to be a ladder mate. If you go like this and like this, white is still kicking after king e2. So rook takes d4 is a deflection sacrifice to ensure that the white rook does not control any squares along the second rank. And of course, now you have a much smoother ladder mate. But there were many, many other mates as well. So this was just one of the possible wins. According to the engine, rook to g3 was also a mating move because rook b1 runs into bishop takes d4 with checkmate. So rook g3 was even faster. Same idea, queen a3 and rook b3. Same idea as king a8 to open up a square so that the rook can jump into the attack. But rook g3 is a really friggin' pretty move. Because if queen takes f6, check, and it's immediately mate. You don't even need the ladder mate. You just checkmate on b2. But this is not a very human move because I think our human instinct is to never allow a move like rook to b1. But bishop takes d4 just supersedes the pin against the black queen. So hopefully that makes sense. After b3, the game is basically over. According to the engine, white could have kept more chances in this position with like rook to h2, and then you get this line where the rook comes into the attack and white runs, and black involves the other rook. This gets a little bit messy, but black is completely winning. It's like +3, +5, and white has to give up his queen to avoid getting checkmated. Okay, guys. Anyways, I'm pretty exhausted. This analysis took a little bit longer than expected because we focused a lot on the opening, which I think is really, really important at these higher levels. So, of course, bishop d7 is a little bit safer. The way that we played was somewhat dubious with b6 and e5, but a very, very interesting game nonetheless. A lot of interesting concepts highlighted, and a very chaotic middle game, but I think largely a well-played game. No big mistakes, and really shows you the importance of playing in a way that's practically difficult for your opponent. Even if you're worse for a lot of the game, I was able to keep the pressure on, and I was able to keep playing against my opponent's king, no matter where it was on the chessboard. And ultimately, that almost always pays dividends. Thank you, Kill One Thunder, for the tier 1. And knight c4, of course, is very pretty, but knight d3 would have been even prettier. Thanks, guys. I'm going to get going. I do have a long day of travel ahead tomorrow, so I will see everybody later.